starting recording. Okay. Hello again. Today I'm going to talk about basically equilibrium change, disequilibrium, instability, all kinds of stuff in economics. Basically, I'm going to talk specifically on economic theory or different versions of economic theory or schools of thought. It's the topic of history of economic thought or economic analysis, but in terms of the equilibrium conceptions, it might be helpful to understand the use of the notion of economics of different schools of thought, basically classical and Marxian thought, neoclassical one, Austrians, Keynesians, post-Keynesians, etc., etc. So maybe we should start, but in order for us to have a proper discussion of these ideas, I believe, we need a conceptual framework or analytical framework, which is based on the idea of mine, of course, of the problems associated with establishing some kind of societies, so to speak. So basically, for modern societies, of course, any form of social and economic organization needs to solve three important problems. One is the problem of coordination. It's an economic problem, basically. Today we are going to talk about this problem. Coordination, allocation of resources, and capital accumulation, especially in the classical and post-Keynesian schools, maybe. And then we have this ethical problem of freedom and the problem of order, how order is created on the basis of intentional behavior of individuals. You know, famous invisible hand thing, about which we have already talked. So basically, in terms of the coordination problem, we should start maybe with three variants of these coordination problems, or corresponding to three notions of equilibrium, I would say. One is what I call synchronic coordination problem, which means basically that it deals with coordination in a static setting. Planned investment and savings equality is a kind of examples, one of the examples of this problem. You know, it's basically static market equilibrium, partial equilibrium framework, or general economic equilibrium of walruses, for example. Again, different forms of synchronic coordination problems. Here, the time does not lapse. In short, at a specific point of time, when many things are given, you know, famous ceteris paribus thing, we economists deal with the determination of equilibrium on the basis of demand and supply, for example. Or we seek in macroeconomics an equality between planned investment and savings, so to speak. So whenever we have this kind of equalities, we can say that there is equilibrium. Here, equilibrium is understood in a Newtonian way as the balance of forces. So equilibrium is usually defined as a kind of state of the rest. You know, there are two different and opposing forces, and eventually there will be a balance between these two opposing forces. Then we have equilibrium. You know, when demand is equal to supply, the market equilibrium price will be determined. So if there's no change, if there's no shift in either demand or supply or both, there would be no change in equilibrium price. So another version of equilibrium analysis is the diachronic analysis. Here we have kind of time, theoretical time, I should say, and change is allowed in a comparative static analysis, basically. You know, in, again, market equilibrium, if there's a shift in the demand curve or the supply curve, the market price will be changing, therefore, until a new equilibrium is reached. So comparative static analysis is basically comparing about two different equilibrium positions. You know, in the beginning, we have an equilibrium, then there's a change or a shift in the demand or supply, or both, doesn't matter. Then a new equilibrium is reached, so we compare the new equilibrium with the old one. Here, the point is that the adjustment process does not take time. So it's instantaneous. You know, whenever there's a shift, a new equilibrium will be determined instantaneously. So no time, no historical time is allowed in this analysis. There are different versions of this kind of conception. One is the famous comparative static analysis, or the shifting equilibrium conception, or temporary equilibrium conception, both of which were developed by John Hicks in macroeconomic analysis, especially, you know, ISLM think. In the macroeconomic analysis, we know that, again, we have some shift variables, such as the investment, or I don't know, marginal propensity to consume, or marginal propensity to save, etc., etc., or the central bank increases money supply, so a new equilibrium will be occurring. So macroeconomics in an ISLM setting is again present us with a comparative static analysis in which different positions of equilibrium are compared. Again, here we usually assume that there's no time changing here. In other words, this equilibria occurs again in an instantaneous fashion. So this is again a static conception, but still a comparative static analysis. There's also a conception, which is rare, I should say, of equilibrium, which is inherently dynamic. You know, the coordination occurs in historical time, and it's about emergence of order in the long run. You know, Alfred Marshall says once that the Mecca of economists is economic biology, in which economic evolution is considered, etc., etc. So this is particularly important, but Marshall's own analysis is basically a static and a comparative static analysis. But he believed that ultimately the basic objective of economics is to reach a kind of evolutionary approach, we should say. So long-run capital accumulation problem in a dynamic setting, again, is an example for this, but the most important, maybe, example is the competition. Different conceptions of competition by Adam Smith, by the Austrian school maybe, but above all, Schumpeter, is based upon such an understanding of equilibrium. So whenever we look at different theories in economics, we can see that one of these, sometimes two of them, sometimes all of them, can be used in the analytical framework. So depending on which conception of equilibrium is used, the results will be different, as we are about to see. Okay, so basically on the basis of this, we can devise this table. I'll say, first of all, framework of analysis is comparative, static in the synchronic conception, and equilibrium is considered as a kind of state of rest. It's a mechanical method, a Newtonian one, basically. The source of exchange is external, you know, it comes outside the system. Order is basically conceptualized as a form or variant of the notion of invisible hand, which is stable at the same time. In the diachronic conception, we have comparative static analysis, or shifting, or temporary equilibrium analysis. Mechanical, again, method is used. And change is caused by some external variables or factors, as in the shifting variables, you know, central bank, for example. And the order is a kind of invisible hand, but in the diachronic analysis, especially in the Keynesian analysis, for example, this order may not be so stable. You know, it's possible to reach an equilibrium, But this equilibrium, as Keynes emphasizes, may not be a kind of full employment equilibrium. That's the basic idea. On the other hand, in the dynamic or evolutionary framework, we have equilibrium conception, but this time it is defined as the lack of structural change. I mean, the structure of the system is still the same, there are changes, but sometimes the very variables or coefficient or structural elements of the system themselves change, as in the evolutionary approach. You know, it's a kind of mutation or some kind of leaps or ruptures. You know, remember our discussion on the punctuated equilibrium thing? There's an equilibrium period, but from time to time, sometimes randomly, a new form of system may emerge, and these structures or orders may be dissipative. They are not stable in that sense. So basically, in the form of, for example, in the example of the creative destruction of Schumpeter's, we have this kind of conception. So in economics, we can have these notions of equilibrium in general. So another useful classification is given by Schumpeter himself in his History of Economic Analysis book in 1954. Well, it was published after Schumpeter's death, actually. He says there are two types of models that can be devised to understand the working of the market system or capitalism, basically. He calls them hitchless and hitchbound systems. Hitchless systems are basically static or comparative static analysis. And the order is spontaneous and efficient, you know, the liberal conception of the invisible hand, and the source of instability external. In the case of hitchless systems, the system itself continues to work almost indefinitely, you know, as in the Newtonian framework, for example. So there is no problem in the working of the system unless there are some kinds of frictions. You know, in the ISLM framework of the Keynesian approach, one of the Keynesians, the frictions take the form of, for example, the rigidity or even stickiness of wages and sometimes prices, right? Whenever these prices are rigid, or wages and or money prices are rigid, then the market system, the system, macroeconomic system cannot reach a full employment equilibrium. So in that sense, there are some hitches, there are some sources of instabilities, which are all external, basically, which hinders the system from, which prevents the system from reaching a stable equilibrium. So there will be an equilibrium again, but not necessarily an efficient one, a kind of invisible backhand approach. On the other hand, in hitchbound systems, we have an open system in the sense that, you know, not every time same causes will create same effects. Sometimes same causes may create different effects. You know, it's a kind of, again, evolutionary understanding of the notion. There may be changes, ruptures, mutations, even revolutions, etc., etc. So that's why the world is not uniform in the sense that same causes will create same effects. So same causes may bring about different effects. So again, sometimes comparative static analysis because of the limitations of the analytical framework, but sometimes even dynamic frameworks can be used. And this order in this kind of conception is again evolutionary, and the sources are internal. You know, we have a system here who can work on the basis of its own dynamics, but still, whenever this system works, it may also create the seeds, so to speak, of its destruction. You know, in Marxian economics, for example, the crisis theory is something like this. You know, whenever capitalism expands its production and capital accumulation, a crisis is inevitable because the same capital accumulation process will create some elements or forces of hitches, basically. So they are internal to the system in the sense that they exist in the very structure of the system and they exert their effects on the working of the system. So whenever a system works, it will create its own destructions in a sense. So that's the idea of hitch bound. So basically, neoclassical economics is based mostly on hitchless systems, analytical frameworks, but on the other hand, you know, the Marxian or Smithian understanding of competition again is the same. And the Schumpeterian creative destruction process is again is a kind of hitch-bound processes. So there are different examples to this elements of hitches, hitch-bound or hitchless systems. In the neoclassical economics, you know, in this table you can see it. I'm going to place it, put them to the Google Classroom so that you can see. The difference between economics and political economy arises from different factors, but in terms of competition and the equilibrium conception, there's a very important difference between the neoclassical and the classical and Marxian frameworks of analysis. In one, we have perfect competition. You know, we all know about the perfect competition. There are infinite number of firms and the buyers, each selling the same homogeneous product. There's no limits for entrance or exit, etc. So always we have this instantaneous, again, kind of equilibrium, but in the notion of free competition, it's basically a conception that rests on the mobility of capital. So whenever there's a high rate of profit in any one of the sectors, capital will move to that sector. So in the long run, only in the long run, the rate of profit will be equalized among the sectors of the economy. So in the long run, there will be a uniform profit rate across the sectors of the economy. So that's why Adam Smith calls them as centers of gravity, you know, again, a Newtonian conception, as if this long-run equilibrium of natural prices, basically, would attract the actual or market prices to themselves. So in the short run, we may not have a uniform profit rate across the sectors because of the existence of competition, but the same forces of competition will produce a tendency for the equalization of the profit rates across the sectors. You know, whenever there's an increase in the rate of profit in any particular sector, capital will move to that sector. Whenever there's a decrease, capital will move out, etc. So in the long run, as a tendency, as an analytical construct, I would also add, a long-run equilibrium price sets will arise, and this price set will depend on the uniform profit rate, as I'm going to show you. On the other hand, again, in terms of Straffa's analysis, for example, we have the same understanding. Straffa is usually considered as a kind of neo-Ricardian. So he follows Ricardo in his footsteps, and he develops in 1961 in his most famous book, well, one and only book, actually, Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities. And even before, in 1926, for example, he argued against the Marshallian conception, basically, and there were two arguments by Straffa in this particular article. One article is that economic analysis should have a general equilibrium conception rather than a partial equilibrium as developed by Marshall. And the other is the idea of the returns to scale under competitive conditions. You know, he basically argues that diminishing and constant returns to scale assumption is necessary for the competition, perfect competition to work. For example, if there is an increasing returns to scale or decreasing cost structure, then the competitive market could no longer exist because one of the firms or all firms working under increasing returns to scale will become monopolist or oligopolist, basically. So in order for us to have a perfect competition, perfectly competitive firm structure or equilibrium, we need diminishing or constant returns to scale, or at least we have to have a U-shaped marginal cost curve in the long run. Another argument of Srappas in 1961 is that one value and price theory must proceed along the classical lines, the idea of surplus, prices of production, etc., etc. Another one is the distribution and risk switching. These are beyond our discussion, actually. Next year you can see them. They are also very important. So prices of production in the classical and Marxian tradition is something like this. Long-run equilibrium prices are to be determined by the uniform profit rate across sectors, which is the result of competition, pre-competition, not perfect competition, be careful. And we can write production cost in an input-output setting. Remember Leontief input-output analysis? That's the basic idea. So basically, X's are quantities of production in each sector, sector 1, sector 2, etc., etc. And the prices are the corresponding prices, basically. Here, X11 means basically total amount of input of the first sector that is used in the output of the first sector, etc. So in terms of the famous technical coefficients of production, this AIJs, which means, in order for the J sector to produce 1 unit of output, how much input of the sector I is needed. These technical coefficients of productions are assumed to be constant, technology is given. So if we restate this system of equation in terms of the technical coefficients, we have this thing, and in the matrix form, we have this P equals AP. P is the price vector, N to 1. A is NN technology matrix in the input Leontief system. And P is again prices. Or if we add the uniform profit rate here for a particular sector, sector J, we have this equation, this thing represents the costs, and this is the additional of profit. So profit margin, a margin of profit will be added to the costs. Therefore, the price of production is determined in a particular sector. But in terms of the whole of the economy, with different sectors, we have only one R here, rate of profit, which is uniform across sectors. And again, if we add also the input L, labor, and W is the price, our equation will become this one, or in the matrix form, we have this thing. Here, the point is that, again, we have N to 1 price vector, N to N technology matrix, labor inputs, physical terms, and this is the wage rate employed of labor employed in different sectors. Here, the point is that this RA is a scalar, which means that it's the same. In each sector, the rate of profit is exactly the same. So this understanding of prices is very important in the classical tradition of classical political economy. Against the neoclassical economics in which the prices are considered as only market prices, these prices, prices of production, or Adam Smith's natural prices, they're actually the same, represents the cost prices, basically, markup prices, cost plus some form of profit, which is surplus. So here we have two different notions of equilibrium. In one, we have a static equilibrium of demand and supply, so market equilibrium, market price will be determined. But in the other, in the classical tradition, the equilibrium prices can occur only in the long run. And also, whenever there's a change in the structure of technology or the distributive shares, wage rate or profit rate, the whole prices will change again. So for each set of technology and distributive shares, there corresponds another price set. So in the long run, these prices will determine or will characterize the long run equilibrium position of the system as a whole. So here again, these prices are sort of theoretical prices in the sense that they emerge only in the long run through pre-competition that creates a uniform rate of profit. But for a specific point of time, in each sector, there will be a different rate of profit. So therefore, we have different prices, different from the long-run equilibrium values. But there's also a tendency for the prices to gravitate towards the long-run equilibrium prices or prices of production, ceteris paribus, of course. So these are two different conceptions. Again, one is more static or comparative static, but the other classical conception is again a kind of comparative static, but it also involves the issues, the problems of adjustment processes of the market prices to the prices of production. Actually, at the same time, prices of production in this framework are usually determined by values. So it's a little more complicated than the general equilibrium model of the Neoclassical school, as in the Walrasian school, and so forth. But still, we can say that even Sraffa's own model is a static or at best a comparative static economic models. But still, there's a striking difference between these two conceptions of equilibrium. Maybe I should stop for now.